Good afternoon and welcome to Survivor Space and today's Survivor Circle session on the male code, the collision between masculinity and trauma. My name is Becky Perkins. I'm the Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project, and we're very glad that you've joined us today. Just a couple of notes about how to participate today. This session is being live streamed on YouTube. So if you want to see a larger screen, you can click on the kind of square icon at the bottom right corner of your screen. It will make it larger. You'll also be able to watch the recording of this session later if you need to leave partway through for any reason. To participate in the chat, all you need to do is go beyond the web page for this session, and the chat box appears right there, and all you need to do is type in your question or your comment. So during today's presentation, there'll be the presentation portion, and then once that is over, we are happy to answer any questions or kind of engage in a discussion from there. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our presenter today, Rick Goodwin, who is with Men in Healing. Very pleased to welcome him to the Survivor Space community. Welcome, Rick.
Oh, thank you, Becky. It's good to be here. And for our studio audience, I must admit this is my first day working for the Zero Abuse Project. So I've got all my anticipatory stress and anxiety already churning in my system as I shared this time with you. So again, welcome everyone. This maybe I'll just say a couple words about me. I'm a clinical social worker. I manage a small clinic up in Canada that has a focus area of working with men in therapy. And what we're primarily known for is our work on trauma recovery, particularly childhood trauma, as well as sexual violence and other adult onset trauma with the men we work with. So we offer individual therapy, group therapy, things like that. Today, though, we're going to be talking about the male code, kind of a critical analysis of sorts of what are the components within masculinity. And we'll see how that intersects, we call it a collision, between the male code and the experience of trauma, whether that be sexual trauma or other forms of childhood abuse. That's the focus of today. So I'm going to suggest, why don't we just get into it? So I trust everyone can see the slide, the opening slide we have here. But first of all, a message for our sponsors, and that would happen to be the U.S. Department of Justice, of which we're very thankful for, to provide funding for this webinar amongst many other services at the Zero Abuse Project. So good on them, and let's continue. So I'm going to say, first of all, a warm welcome to any men that may be viewing today's webinar. And saying that, there may well be other folks of other genders also viewing, possibly in that they have a loved one who is male identified. They have a friend, a family member, someone that they have concern for. And you have as much, right being at the table here as folks who are male identified, because this is not an isolated issue, and it's what we know about trauma. It's a community concern, not a concern of any particular gender. That being said, these 6 words, it didn't happen, it doesn't matter, probably encapsulates so much of what Western society has considered in terms of male sexual trauma. We know that the silence around sexual abuse of children, adult sexual assault, the silence was broken by the second wave of the feminist movement back in the late 70s and 80s. And that focus was on the experiences of women and girls. And here we are now, almost 50 years later, and speaking on behalf of men's services, playing catch up, because it was framed as a focus on women and girls. So men didn't really factor much in that initial movement. And we also know that in society, there's a sense of an aspect of consideration of masculinity as something, well, maybe it's not a big deal for guys if they did experience, say, sexual abuse. Guys can kind of tough it out. They can kind of let it roll off their backs. They can, and that's what we think of when we think of masculinity. So these 6 words is what many men come up against in terms of coming to their own terms of their own trauma history. Okay, so if we get into this, we got to go a little bit slow, and our time today is limited, but maybe rather than talk about masculinity, we need to talk about many masculinities. As men or masculinity is is a fixed concept. It's a wide gamut of expression, and these are just some of the concepts and terms that we use when we explore aspects of male identity. Male identity would it be our sexual identity, whether it be our sexual orientation or issues of sexual expression. There's a wide basis of terms and identities we need to consider, in part so that our services are as inclusive as they can be. So I want to recognize that before we get into this concept called the male code. Now, the male code is a pretty, what we refer to as a granddaddy theorist or a theory when it comes to masculinity. So much of our analysis and intervention working with men who've experienced trauma has been fairly recent. I'd say started in the early 1990s. It's often referred to the new psychology of masculinity. If you went to a psychology library, there would be a small section, on the second bottom shelf, and it would be this critical analysis. But we could follow any of the new writers, the major writers of masculinity today, and they will all make reference back to the seminal work by David and Brannon back in 1976 called The Male Code. And this is what I wanted to speak on today. They came up with 4 distinct yet intertwining codes of behavior that boys and male youth, this is their primary learning goal in life. Now, of course, it's not in any book and it's not in the school curriculum, but this is what every boy needs to learn in order to be successful. And why is it every time I'm on camera doing a webinar, I get an itchy nose? But there you go, folks. So the male code, if we put ourselves into this boy's head, we know he's hamming it up for the camera, and yet there's something about it. We all know what that's about, to show off his strength, the biceps, the future manhood awaits him. And this is, we need to discern this. We need to unpack it a bit to understand its parts. David and Brannon referred to 4 parts of the male code. I'm taking the liberty to make that 5, just in ease for understanding. Let's start getting into these one by one to see what they're all about. So here's the first concept we need to consider, that to be a man in today's world, to be successful in the male identity, you've got to be tough, you've got to be rugged, and you've got to be individualistic. And the images that you see are ways to stir up your consideration of the topic. So even though that we are social animals, we are social beings, that has been a core component of our survival as a species on this planet since we first started out on the plains of Africa. Um, this notion that as men we have to separate ourselves from the collective, from the community, and through that separation, that's how we form our identity, is probably the core expression of the vast majority of men. Now, if we truly believe, though, that men were rugged, and all what that word means, we would have no understanding of how men present in this world, because men so often than not don't truly show their ruggedness. They show their vulnerability. And I need to put this into examples to make sense of it. If men were truly rugged, of all the genders, men were the rugged ones, well, why is it that as guys we have significantly higher rates of drinking and drugging than, say, women? As men, if we were strong and independent and tough, why is it that men die of suicide about 3 times the rate of women dying of suicide? What? And we could go through statistics like this again and again, and kind of wonder, well, what's up? What's going on here? Because how we present ourselves is not necessarily the reality that we live. And we need to consider this in terms of how we hold ourselves as men, and the values we take, the values of masculinity that we're taking to ourselves. And so again, some images of strong men, certainly. And I have the picture of Nelson Mandela up there in particular, because some of the challenges of looking at masculinity in this way might be a suggestion that, well, if we could just kind of clear this stuff around masculinity, all these old stereotypes and what have you off the table, then men would be better off. And I guess my response to that, it isn't that easy. And we could take the example of Nelson Mandela, who, a great personal sacrifice, 27 years in captivity. He was able to lead his people into justice. Now, that took enormous sacrifice from him. And yet, if we say, well, the rugged individual really shouldn't be part of the masculine identity anymore, then we would be losing heroes and leaders, much like Nelson Mandela. So this value set is, I don't even know if I'd want to call it a value set. A value set suggests we can change our values. And yet I think when we come to the coreness of gender identity, it goes deeper than that. Anyways, let me move on. The big man is a second core concept of the male code, and it's fairly cross-cultural. You go to most cultures in this world, and you'll see men order off in terms of relative space, in terms of relative power between each other. And of course, the fulfillment of the male code is to become the big man. And again, just a variety of images to get you thinking of what that may look like in society. For every big man that's out there, of course, there are many, many men who don't hold that standing. So we have to consider that in terms of the big man, most men fail. There may be only episodes in a person's life at best that they temporarily have that stature. Maybe they were good on the football team in school. Maybe they achieved economic success that other people can recognize. Maybe they get on TV and are a name brand person type of thing. If we achieve the big man status, then we get acknowledged as such. And of course, if we are much lower on that pecking order, well, we're a man without, and we're men without identity. The homeless folks in this town who are prominently men in terms of visible homelessness, we provide services to that community. Many of those men don't even have a key to signify that they have a space of their own. So again, the big man may be the idealized self, and yet so many men experience a life of a failure to not achieve that. The third value set is referred to as give 'em hell, and this is one that we're probably most familiar with, is men's close relationship to aggression and violence. And some of that violence is sanctioned, and some of that violence certainly is not sanctioned, and yet there's a lot of areas we don't know what to do with. But we do know that, again, aggression and violence is a male domain. We could look at the percentages of people in prison who've been convicted of a crime of violence, and we'll find close to 90% of those will be men. We could take our armed forces, and even though that there's been discrimination against women, I mean, that's been gone now for a while, but we still find the armed forces to over 80% male in identity. So this is very close to men's hearts, whether or not they perpetrate violence or not. Men have a very close relationship to this topic. Now, here's where I'm going to split their fourth value set in half. Right? I'll divide it into two. So it was referred to initially as no sissy stuff. And I'm going to suggest that as men, knowing that conventional masculine identity, with the pinnacle, is still an expression of male heterosexuality, that we have this process for that as men to be successful, then we have to reject any perception that one could see femininity in us. So I could make reference to a young man I know. I'll call him John. John is about 20, and he's about the same age as my youngest daughter. And when John was a boy, when he was like 5, 6, 7, he was a kid in the dance classes, and he was a kid who wanted to be the center of attention. And I remember one time being over at his parents' place Saturday night, adults are in the living room, and he comes downstairs wearing his sister's tutu to put on a dance show for the adults. And, how sweet was that? And that's how John was. But, fast forward, he's nothing at all like that anymore. His expression is much more conventional in terms of masculinity. And here's the consideration, that at some tender age, he realized that the stuff he loved to do, the dressing up, the performance, the dance, the movement of body, something girls do, not boys. And so this is what we consider then his inner psychological journey of sorts. He had to reject these qualities in himself. It's almost like he had to give up part of himself. Girls. And all that being said, then it allows the put down, the subjection of those qualities. Now, I'm not saying my young friend John does that, but one of the greatest insults boys give each other in the schoolyards is to call each other girls. Like it's a put down. And so John doesn't dance anymore. This rejection of femininity, we can now consider this, well, maybe this is the undercurrent of misogyny, of women hating, because of the rigidity of the male code. So give that some consideration, and I'll do the part 2 now. So same dynamic, we can talk about, my young friend John and how he used to dance and all that, but he doesn't do that anymore. Now, maybe he didn't give that stuff up because it was what girls do. Maybe he gave all that stuff up because that's what those gay guys do. And here we would still find the similar process. He would have to give up part of himself, his qualities, his interests, his aspirations. He would project it on the other, and the other in this case would be gay men or gay folk. And then from that projection on the other, it allows for a rejection or a put down or a subjugation. That's what those gay guys do. And again, just like with the previous concept, we can find many, many examples of this subjugation of gay men, violence, discrimination. So we again, that foundation, what we're finding, maybe the foundation of homophobia, all in regards to this male code that is so rigid and ungiving. So there's a lot to consider right there. And this is an area that we need to explore closely with men who are seeking recovery from trauma, because so much of the male code won't allow them to open up, won't allow them to be vulnerable, or won't allow them to consider what the healing path would be in their lives. We could say, if we had to summarize all the male code in one word, it would be something like invulnerable. Now, if that is really the code word for masculinity, then it's impossible for any man to acknowledge that he was victimized, because invulnerable people cannot be victimized by definition. So here is the rub, or as we call it in the group programs we run, this is the big impossible that men have to overcome. Part of that is to ask lots of questions. Where did the guys learn to act like men? Is it from their family? Who are their role models? Their age, their culture, their race. Small town, big city. How old are they? We know things are changing. And I'm going to say overall, despite hardship and struggle, things in many respects are changing for the better. We're seeing a loosening of some of these male code, the scripts of these male codes. And yet still the kicker here is, how do men acknowledge their victimization? And does this male code stuff, does it get in the way of men seeking help? And we know from research that men take much longer to come to terms with these issues. We had a study in our clinic, the average age of men seeking trauma recovery from childhood abuse is 45. The average age of men being sexually abused is between 9 and 10. So that means on average, men experience about 3.5 decades of silence and quiet suffering before kind of putting up their hand and saying, hey, I was abused as a kid, I need some help. So again, it's back to that big impossible. We have yet to figure out how we can speed things along for men, particularly young men. How we can kind of fast forward the opportunity of healing, in part to avoid that 3.5 decades of suffering that are in so many of the men's lives. And we know with that suffering comes other issues that compound things: alcohol, drug use, compulsive behaviors, emotional dysregulation, conflict with the law. We can go on and on where we know male survivors do end up in this world. And yet, how can we overcome this notion of invulnerability is a real question. There's a colleague of mine who has done lots of writing on the subject. He says that for men, they have to experience what he refers to as a psychological death in order to get on the healing path. Now, those are big words. And yet I think he's on to something. That if we as men identify to this male code and we hold on to it tightly, there's no opportunity for us to seek recovery. So it requires us to shift our own identities, our own sense of masculinity to find that opening. So I'm going to finish off on this slide, and then we'll get to more of a conversation. I'm going to quote John Briere, who's kind of a smart guy in this work we do. He starts off with saying, there's no doubt that men and women experience many of the same traumatic events, and they suffer many in the same ways. I mean, we know post-traumatic stress is a universal characteristic of those who've been traumatized. Doesn't matter where you're from, skin color, whatever. Patterns of post-traumatic stress in the broad strokes are the same, but here's the rub. Some traumas are more common in one gender than the other. And our sex role socialization, what the male code is all about, affects two things. One is how the injuries are experienced, like at the moment the abuse or assault occurs, and then how the post-traumatic expression unfolds in the child's life, in the youth, life of the youth, and of course, well into adulthood. If we can do that, then we may find an opening in working with men on the healing journey. So, Becky, I think I'll wrap up the formal presentation there, and let's see what we have in the way of questions or conversation.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Thanks for a great presentation. A lot of important things to think about and consider for sure. We did have one question that came in just now. As a man myself, how can I help a male friend to open up or to seek help? He refuses to acknowledge the trauma of his past, but it clearly affects him.
Oh boy, that's a big question, and I wish I had a great answer for that. We have lots of analogies about the limitations we can offer each other in terms of coming to terms with things that we may see in them. You know, that tired notion of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. That does come to mind, and I've been working in this field for about 30 years now. I've yet to figure out how to do that. And I get calls from partners of men. I get calls from parents of young men. So I've gotten calls from kids of their, who's saying my father needs this program, and yet it does seem like it's such a unique journey of coming to a place to say, aha, oh, I need this help as well. And as long as your friend there knows that there are places to go to, and there are services for men are few and far between. So I want to give that some serious consideration as well. But as long as he knows that there's an avenue, an opportunity to seek help, I think that's really about the limit. And where friendships and partnerships and families kind of get mucked up a bit here, and I'm using this word deliberately, but I don't mean to say it harshly, is that those partners or family members or friends have to stay in their own lane, in the sense that they can't, get out of their lane, go into their friends or partners or lovers' lane, and do the work for them. That would be a mistake, and it may backfire on the relationship between the two. So when we engage in partners, we say, be there, be solid, be present. But your partner is a partner. Your partner is not a project. You can't do this work for him. And I think, back to the question, I think the same response would have to be given.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Other folks have questions or comments? Take your time and feel free to type them in. Rick, from my perspective, while folks are thinking and hopefully typing, from my perspective as a woman, as a survivor, as an ally in this space, how can I use my kind of position as a woman? Because we all have a certain amount of privilege, a certain amount of access in different spaces based on our different identities, and certainly women as survivors have their own challenges that go back a long ways. But we also have a certain amount of privilege in terms of people tend to see us as being vulnerable to abuse and are more likely to take us seriously and that sort of thing. So how can women kind of use that sort of position that society sees us in to help men to access healing?
Wow. Multifaceted question, if I may say, Becky. Let's start off. Oh boy. Okay, let's talk about sort of society or broader community structures, and we'll narrow it down to So the first thing, I think, and this is more of a political statement, is that, and this is happening. It's happening slowly, but because women are the primary stakeholders of the anti-violence movement, of which sexual abuse is, obviously we're part of that. We're not the whole thing, but we're part of that. Women's services, in my opinion, need to always ensure that there's room at the table for services for men, for services of other genders to take place, to be there, to be listened to. Now, that hasn't always happened, but I don't want to reflect on the past. I want to reflect about right now. So I would say that we've always got to make that room at the table for folks who have not had a voice, whether it's on gender, whether it's on other identifiers like that. So that's one thing. In terms of being a service provider, our whatever track record of maybe 25 years of having this clinic up here, we've always had women therapists. We believe that the gender of the therapist doesn't really play a significant role as long as the therapist, the worker, is male-centered in their approach. And of course, to be male-centered is up here, has nothing to do with our plumbing. So all our staff are trained, and we offer training to other agencies about how to work with men. And if you can be competent in your provision and counseling to folk in respect of aspects of masculinity, like the male code, then wonderful. We need you. We need you to work with men. So and that's a message then to service providers on your question. And then lastly, I think when it comes down to the individuals, is not unlike probably what women survivors need to be heard or need to hear, which is, like they need to be heard, they need to be believed, they need to have that. We need to be at their side as they choose the next steps on their journey. So there might be a statement that goes well beyond gender. just back to the humanity of what's ahead of us, the humanity of that person who is wounded, who has an envision of living a happier, healthier life. And we can all walk with each other in that regard.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And kind of related to that piece of this discussion, another question: what do you think are the pros and cons of providing services for males in male-based agencies and females in female-based agencies?
Well, that's an interesting one. I don't think agency structures, I mean, I have no issue with agency structures that are dedicated to a gender, as long as there's resources for other genders in that community. But I'll tell you, the community that I live in, there are 3 publicly funded sexual assault centers. None of them will work with men. So this, discrimination or biases can be institutionalized like that. In terms of sheer numbers, I'm clear about, for male survivors, sexual abuse as children, we're 1 in 6, and I include myself in that number too. 1 in 6, it's more than one agency in town that's going to do the job. And we're talking about thousands, depending where you live, of course, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds, of male identified folk who have been harmed. So yes, there may be services at, say, at a sexual assault center, and yet any place that serves men will be faced with survivors. Any place that men live, and that means jails, and that means addiction centers, and that means homeless services, and that, group homes, and on and on and on and on. Ultimately, though, I would like to think that we can all agree is that no survivor should be left behind. And whether that's true on the basis of gender, it could be on the basis of many other attributes. But that I think is the bottom line.
Thank you. Another question: are there books that you recommend to help men understand their trauma better?
Yes, there are. Mike Liu wrote the first book called Victims No Longer. That's a bit dated, but it's still out there. There's been a second print run of that. A lot of guys find that a fairly accessible book. Richard Gardner, who I referenced earlier, New York psychologist, has written a number of books. Some are written for professionals. He has one book written for for the guys type of thing. You may want to check him out. His third name, Howard Fradkin, old colleague from Ohio, and memory game. What's his book called? Howard Fradkin is his name. And I'm sorry, Howard, if you're listening in, I forget the title of your book. But Mr. Google should help in that regard.
I've actually met Howard before too, being from Ohio.
Okay, yes, of course.
Wonderful, wonderful human being, and so knowledgeable.
Yes, for sure.
Yes. We had a comment. Yes, I struggle with this issue as a provider who has specialized for most of my career in working with female identifying victims and survivors, but there are so many people who still need help. I really respect and admire the work you're doing. So thank you for who you are and what you're doing.
Oh.
Amen to that.
Yeah, I appreciate those kind words. If you're interested in a male-centered training, if you're a service provider, there is an event coming up that is an online event sponsored by 1 in 6. So numeric 1, in6.org is our American partner agency. And I work for 1 in 6 on training initiatives and what have you. And so it's a day-and-a-half event that will be in person in New Mexico, online though. And apart from that, I don't have more specifics to give, but that may be worthwhile checking out if that's of interest.
And for those who are tuning in and listening, be sure to join the Survivor Space Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, I will include information about that event and also the books and authors that Rick just mentioned, so you'll have that information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky.
Yeah. So I know we just have a few minutes left. If there are any other questions or comments. Rick, I'm curious, just in kind of the evolution of your career, have you found that online spaces offer more accessibility for some men who may feel intimidated by sort of the traditional face-to-face therapeutic environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. It'd be lovely to see some research on this, which I don't think there is. But I can provide, anecdotal information. 1 in 6 offers a number of online support groups. You show up, you give a nickname, so you don't have to tell people who you are. Really, there's that anonymity is well policed, so that people don't acknowledge who they are, and it's peer support along with education on core trauma recovery skills, and it's facilitated by a professional therapist. So I think you got the best of both worlds in one room. Now, we get guys showing up for that, and they may be active for weeks or months, and then they might consider actually checking out therapy. So if we think of survivors, and it doesn't matter of any gender, as a triangle, then we know the top of the triangle, folks may be active in counseling, active in therapy, but we know there's so many more people that may have thought about it but have not accessed that. And then I'm not saying therapy is a be-all and end-all. There's every society around the world has its own traditional means of healing and recovery. We can't say, oh, we figured this all out in therapy. But if that, we know that there's so many folks that might find that of benefit that have yet to access it. If being in an online anonymous capacity is a stepping stone to that, wonderful. And so that's why I'm a big believer in online engagement. And maybe one day the person will want to be face-to-face or in a group setting and realize that their story of thinking, oh, I'm the only one that this has happened to, and it's shared by 8 other guys around the circle, that they may come for them as well.
Thank you. We'll give a couple more minutes here for any last minute questions or comments. If you love today's session so very much that you want to see it again, Rick is going to be offering it again this Thursday, I believe, at noon Eastern. Next week, we also have our first survivor-led Survivor Circle session on the 7th at noon. One of our wonderful Survivor Space survivor subject matter experts will be giving a presentation on kind of the medical impact of trauma and sort of your self-advocacy in that space. So we're looking forward to that session. Thank you, Rick, for your great presentation today and responding to some great questions. I appreciate you joining us and for your time.
Well, it's my first day here. Glad that's over.
You did quite well, and no problem with the itchy
Okay,
nose.
thank you.
We've all got something.
Always happens so, huh?
Well, thank you all very much. We will leave the chat open for a little while, so if anyone has questions that come to mind after the session's over, I can certainly get a question over to Rick if there's, something that he can answer for you. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Bye, folks.